For this live stream, we're going to be talking about Trump's ruling on family planning. Then I'm stripping $285 billion from Planned Parenthood. But before we get to that point, I'd like everybody to consider donating to my Patreon page. The link is in the chat right now. If you don't hit at the chats right now, if you're going to be entering later, then the link is going to be in the description at the bottom. Now we're going to basically be covering a few different points. We're going to basically be covering the fact of what this is covering, of what this, if this is a cruel act, what the government's role in this should be, and covering some of the ideas of the history of the idea of Planned Parenthood and eugenics and the major player in Planned Parenthood itself, at the history of it, because we need to kind of look at that. Now, it's probably not going to sit well with people on this that actually support Planned Parenthood or support abortion, even if they're pro-choice with it, because just the actual nature of the whole issue, because of what we're talking about here. But what we're going to go with first with it is the ruling of separating the actual buildings. Basically, all this does is, it's very, very simple. It basically says if you do not separate the family planning, the actual decision making, from the actual buildings that are that you're performing the abortions in, you will have all of your money stripped. Now, the reason why they don't want to do this is because why this is considered catastrophic for Planned Parenthood specifically, because this is who's getting that money, is this goes into a major point, and is because of when we talk about this, this should be viewed as what is really going on. Now, historically, is we need to understand where these areas are located. These go into targeted areas, and people don't want me to mention. People are going to freak out when I start mentioning this. These are actually targeted areas with specific minorities, and it's not because of they're doing this to help the disadvantaged. That has nothing to do with it, because then they would do that by income levels. And they're actually doing this solely for the reason of the original business model. And the original business model was for the idea of what were considered favored races. And we're getting to that a little bit later in this discussion, but just put that in the back of your head, that basically is the foundation of the organization has this idea of what were positive races and what were negative races. And this is the whole point. They had this idea that they need to create this ideal racial formation, and that they felt that eugenics was the manner of doing this. As we see, we will talk about eugenics later in this discussion, but this was the actual formation of why they do this. Now, when if they had to move their locations, they're not going to get the same demographics. When we talk about urban locations, just by moving over something such as a half a mile to a mile off of a location, your demographics can drastically change. And sometimes the customer base is going to change a great deal, and you're not going to get your business model outcome as you wished. Now, it's not necessarily that they're looking for an actual customer base, they're looking for an actual outcome. Because the fact is they're getting money from people, and it's not necessarily from their customer base. Their actual uh, their actual money that they're getting from that's making them from the finances is from government subsidies from both states, from state, local, and federal levels. Certain states are pulling their money, obviously, which is causing them sometimes to move because they realize they can kind of see the writing on the wall where they're not wanted, and that's where sometimes they'll pull out of certain areas because they'll see that basically they'll see the writing on the wall. Then they get their other money from the sale of from fetal body tissue, which is considered illegal. But they're what it called. But they have advocates in courts which are essentially looking the opposite way and letting them do it, even though it is completely illegal. They're allowing them to claim that they're neutral in the actual cost by them writing out all of these expenditures that don't exist. Then what they're also doing is they're using a lot of these donations that they're getting from left-wing groups and Hollywood. They're essentially bankrolling their organization, so that they're basically getting a lot of money through those sources. So even if the government were to pull 100% of its funding, they would still have all these sources. The only times where they would actually leave is basically where they would actually have these other problems. Now, what's actually happening is when they actually have to move their demographics. Because of that, they don't want that, and sometimes there's areas where buildings cannot be separated between these two things unless they were to actually make a purchase of a building next door. That would be the only other option for them. Now, that in certain urban areas, that can be very, very expensive. Now, they do not want to have to make these purchases because the fact is that would add to their costs. And then you have the taxation, because when you do with urban areas, their urban areas have much higher tax levels because of all these social welfare programs that obviously, ironically enough, groups like Planned Parenthood support. Now, when we talk about this thing, we need to talk about the point is this a cruel or fair act? Well, we need to talk about the actual role of government to be talking about that. And when we look at that, number one is this is not even getting into the role of getting these places that perform the abortions up to an actual basic standard of allowing gurneys to come through. So we're not even talking that is cruel to the actual business itself, because we're not even enforcing some type of regulation to make sure that these women are safe when they have their abortions to begin with. It's not stating that women cannot have abortions. It's just creating a standard to make sure that money given out for these abortions are going to solely for that's basically when women have abortions, the actual buildings are separate, and that they're considered separate entities, and that money going for abortion is set aside for abortion, money going for family planning that's coming from the government is going to those family planning centers, and those are completely separate. Which means what Trump is actually doing is basically making sure that they're separating their entities and doing it through a lawful method. And what he's doing essentially is just completely lawful. And it basically means that people are not having to send money for an activity that they do not believe in. So essentially what he's doing is he's doing the opposite of what would be cruel and would actually be considered unfair activity. Now, there's going to be people that completely disagree with that point, but that's the thing with it, because now what we could go with the point of saying is that they are another private entity and should actually, and just like any other group claiming that they are a charity, should not be getting any government funding, just as any other group should not be getting government funding. And if we look at that, that they're lucky that they're getting any government funding at all, and that should be viewed as in that manner. It doesn't matter what they're claiming. This is why we get to the point of looking at that rational argument instead of looking in a way where we're trying to judge things by feelings. This is why we keep going back to that point. We don't judge things by feelings for that sole purpose. Because when we do that, we start talking about irrational, we start acting in a very, very irrational manner. And we start making crazy statements that basically do not make any sense whatsoever. And the government's role should not be in funding any private charity group. Doesn't matter what type of thing it is. It could be for helping out orphans, to helping out war widows, to helping out whatever the purpose. But no charity group should be funded by the government. These are private groups, and they need to basically be on their own. And that should be the actual idea. Now, then that's where we need to go from that point. Now we need to get into the next little area. This is where things are going to get a little bit rough for many of these people. Now, before we actually start getting into the definitions on certain words, we're going to have to actually go over the actual history of Planned Parenthood and some of the ideas of eugenics. We know eugenics from, obviously, the stuff from Adolf Hitler with exterminating people, doing experiments on people, but we need to understand that he did not come up with this stuff alone. He actually was inspired by American eugenics. Where did this American eugenics come from? It came from actually our systems, which were actually from the Birth Control League and other allies with that. And the Birth Control League was the predecessor that became Planned Parenthood. Who was the head of the Birth Control League? Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. Some of the quotes you should actually note from her is such things as the most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. This is from Women and the New Race, Chapter 5. The Wickedness of Creating Large Families. This is from 1920. Here's one that's from a letter to Dr. Clarence J. Gamble, December 10th, 1939, page 2. We do not want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. There's another one. Here's another one. I accepted an invitation to talk to the women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan. I was escorted to the platform, was introduced, and began to speak. In the end, through simple illustrations, I believed I had accomplished my purpose. A dozen invitations to speak to similar groups was proliferated. Right there. This should be, this is from Margaret Sanger, an autobiography published 1938, page 366. This shows you right there. Your founder of Planned Parenthood, that's supposed to be for about equality and everything, was basically working with the women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan. If you look at some of the other ones, I mean, you will see that Okay, right here. Feeble-mindedness perpetuates itself among the ranks of those who are blandly indifferent to their racial responsibilities. And it's largely this type of humanity we are now drawing upon to populate our world for the generations to come. In this orgy of multiplying and replenishing the earth, this type of pesu multiplying and perpetuating those dirtiest evils, we must, if civilization is to survive, extirpate by the very roots. Margaret Sanger, The Pivot of Civilization, 1922. Here's another one. Birth control itself, often denounced as a violation of natural law, is nothing more or less than the facilitation of a process of weeding out unfit, preventing the birth of defectives or those who will become defectives if we are to make racial progress. This development of womanhood must precede motherhood in every individual woman. Woman in the New Race, 1920. So if we're talking about what she was an actual eugenicist and racist. This is what basically what it was about. It was about basically eliminating these unfavored races from the earth. This meant blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, Eskimos, and other things such as that, and basically promoting whites, because whites were not breeding fast enough. The idea was to basically eliminate this, and that's why they use the terms feeble-minded, and they would use these a lot of times instead. If you look in some of her writings, they would actually use these terms such as that: feeble-minded, unfit, and that's why you'll find certain terms like that in certain pieces of her writing, and they would change around these words depending on the who she was talking to, and that's what needs to be understood. And this is basically what was going on. Now, if you look at what's basically what they were doing out in Germany, this is exactly what they were doing to the Jews, and to what they were doing to the Jews. They were also doing it to blacks who were out in Germany, and they were doing it to the political dissidents as well as gypsies. And this was done specifically within the same model, and they knew it. And if you look at everything that's done with it, with Planned Parenthood actually has a specific idea of what they want to have done, is to eliminate these groups. And if you look at their locations are very, very specific. They're not in specific locations for no reason. When it comes down to it, is they want these groups of people eliminated. What their focus right now has been is blacks and Hispanics, and they look at specific areas because of this area. They want these they look at locations where they can actually centralize. And the reason why they fight any type of ruling where they would have to move or what would cause them to essentially move from either upgrading a facility because it doesn't fit where the hallways could be wide enough for fitting a gurney through. They would actually protect a woman's life when having an abortion, or making a hallway, or basically separating a building. They would actually mean separating areas from where the abortion is done and where the counseling for the actual family planning is done. Because the fact is that would actually mean that could actually wreck their idea of location, and they don't want the idea of location changed. And this is a big problem for them. And while they try to say things have changed from what the time of what Margaret Sanger was saying, and there's a little bit of a troubled history of Margaret Sanger, but there's still good things about Planned Parenthood. there's not really, because when you look at their history, when you look at their recent history, they've claimed that it's safer for a black woman to have an abortion than to bring a child to labor. That shows like they're trying to eliminate black people from this earth. When you look at their actual population in numbers, you see the fact is that's exactly been their goal, but compared to when the actual their actual population in percentages, that it's gone down basically by 2/3. When you see those numbers, and you can tell that there's actually been a goal behind this, you can see that basically they're looking to exterminate these people. And the only reason why they're looking at bringing in new Hispanic, why the Democratic Party's only been looking to bring in new Hispanic people, is to replace these voters, but they have no reason to not send them down to the same fate, because they don't care about lives. Now, when we actually look at the definition on abortion, to abort something on Merriam-Webster, which is a good source, they say to terminate a procedure prematurely. If you click on the idea of abortion, it means, you'll see what it says on that is it comes down to the termination of a pregnancy after accompanied by, resulting in, or closely followed by the death of an embryo, fetus, or such as, and it gives a different example, which an induced expulsion of a human fetus. When we look at what the definition of a pregnant is, which would be the previous point, containing a developing embryo, fetus, or unborn offspring of within the body. When we're talking offspring, we can actually look up that term right there, and you'll actually see that offspring is the product of a reproductive process of an animal or plant. And if you look down with it, you will see what it says, child. Now, a child would actually be a life. When you actually terminate a life, it's basically a person who kills another. And actually, going back to the top, we see right up here is we see the most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it, which goes down as homicide. And that would actually show as the actual end results of what we're talking about here, is homicide or murder or whatever you want to call it. That's the actual end results, and it's basically a downfall of the actual society. And it's actually a racial-based homicide, and they're essentially having these certain mothers play an actual role in it, inadvertently telling them lies about it, and essentially insisting that they should not have access to seeing what they're doing, because they know if they see what they're doing that they would essentially turn the other way and say, no, I'm not doing this, because they know that they would have an actual conscience and be against homicide, because that's just a natural action of basically moral human beings. No moral human being would want to sentence another one to die. Very, very few of them would actually have that activity. Even if they basically felt that it was an inconvenience, they would still think about other methods to deal with their issue. Be it basically adoption or basically keeping the kid itself. They would go with one of those two options. And that's why we look at that point. And that's why when we look at what they're doing with it, is basically we know that that's the actual goal. And to convince people that, I mean, that this is why when we look at it, we should actually cherish life and not consider it as an actual disease. And this is why they come up with, this is why when people on the right claim that, have actually put out the claim that people on the left do not believe in science, this is basically a fact. It is because when we put forth the idea that these individuals have their own DNA signature, they try to say that, oh no, there's a lump of cells. Well, no, they have their own DNA signature. They're completely different. And then they'll go with my body, my choice. Well, no, that doesn't apply, because when we look at the actual idea of that, you're essentially nothing but a holder of an actual another life. If you're holding hands with basically with a boyfriend, or if a boyfriend's holding your hands, he cannot claim that he owns you then and say, oh, my body, my choice, and throw you over a bridge. That's called homicide. Just because he's holding you at that time does not give him that right. And that's the same thing does apply. Well, this is where we need to understand these ideas. And with what Trump did here with it is he only created a standard at which he was only separating with it as, and to me, I feel that he could have, that Congress should actually go further than this and use the idea of the Declaration of Independence and actually essentially ban it completely, and actually get the idea that Roe v. Wade should be overthrown itself, because when we're talking life is life, they should do the same thing for the death penalty as well, because there is no statute that says you lose your ability to life from a criminal statute. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that. And when we look at that, and when we look at that point, beyond what they might want to state in states' rights with it, it still doesn't apply. Just like there's no legitimacy to the war on drugs. The war on drugs was it was a UN agenda that we end up adopting and claiming just because we create another agency gives validity. No, you need a constitutional amendment for that, just like we did for alcohol. And just like with this, you need to actually create some type of argument. And the fact is this argument is from an actual person that did not believe in the natural law, which was completely opposite of what we actually know of things. She actually opposed the idea of natural law. She felt that parents should have to apply for permits for parenthood, and just complete utter nonsense. And it was meant to basically target minorities. She felt minorities should not be given the right to basically have kids. That was the sole purpose. And she worked with these progressive leaders, specifically the progressive leaders, because she knew that they were working with the KKK, and it would be the easiest to eliminate the blacks and the other minorities from actually having kids, because she wanted the idea of establishing permits, because she knew that she could do this. She was not this ideologue for equality and any of this other stuff. She was this ideologue for basically eugenics and exterminating minorities. And this is where we find what the history of Planned Parenthood is. It was a dark time. The history of Roe v. Wade was also another time. And she should be remembered as one of the worst people in the history of our nation. And she should be known for basically murder, racism, eugenics. She should basically be known as America's Hitler. And basically nothing other than that should basically should be the legacy of Margaret Sanger. And when you think of Planned Parenthood, think of Margaret Sanger. When you think of any of these abortion clinics, think of Margaret Sanger. This is what you should be thinking of. This should be the thing with it. Think of Adolf Hitler. This is basically what it is, and that's basically what she was. She was America's Adolf Hitler. And this is basically, she wanted to wipe out all these minorities. And when we look at it, it was basically, she felt that just killing an infant, basically smothering an infant, would be basically completely justified, because it was just fine to do, because we shouldn't have blacks out there in the world, because they're not needed. And for anybody out there that actually believes that if anybody out there believes that that's a good idea, they should be smacked upside the head. For anyone that actually believes in actual real equality, they should actually be saying, we want this place shut down immediately, every location. Which is why you find an actual Chinese woman running it, the actual person that comes from a country that actually had a one-child policy, where basically if you actually dared to give birth without sanction to a girl and tried to hide her, they would have a car run over her head. And this is basically what you're trying to basically have be funded and say it's a beneficial, and it's women's health. It's not women's health, it's murder. That's like saying a serial killer is not bad. They're just thinning the herd. That's the same argument that you can make. I mean, that's as twisted of an argument as you can make with that. There's nothing good about abortion. It's just basically, it's just murder. That's all you're doing, is just peddling murder and peddling racism with people. Basically, it destroyed the black community. It kills basically more people die of abortion than have actually died of every cause that basically kills people in the United States total, and endorse everything. So when we look at it, we need to understand that we should actually eliminate all of this type of garbage. That's why we should actually become a pro-life country. When it comes to everything, we need to basically remove all our bases overseas, bring them all the way back here, only work on defense. We need to essentially eliminate the death penalty, eliminate the war on drugs, which means you'll clear out basically 90% of our prisons, which means you only have room for our actual violent offenders. Eliminating the death penalty will not be a problem, because essentially you won't have a backlog. And then what will happen is you won't be releasing any violent offenders. You'll just be releasing people who are perfectly fine. And then you basically eliminate abortion, which will essentially create the country being pro-life. And it'll be creating a standard of saying, we don't hate minorities. Allow minorities to actually have a fair shake. There's nothing worse that wipes out minorities worse than the war on drugs and abortion. If you want to actually help them out by ending the war on drugs, abortion, and ending those two things. That if you want to help them out more, and the minimum wage laws and regulations within these cities, and gun control. Trust me, those things will actually help everybody out, because it'll basically make it to where they can actually have a fair shake at things. Otherwise, basically, you're saying you hate minorities. And you basically, when it comes to it, you can't exactly say that I hate minorities. My niece is half black. My fiance is a Filipino. So you're not exactly going to essentially accuse me of being anti-minority. And it's not exactly going to work. I'm not exactly racist by any stretch of the imagination. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Um, Make sure you, if you want to donate through Patreon, that's right below here. And then I will see you guys probably tomorrow. This is probably gonna be my nightly post with it. If you missed the earlier one, there's gonna be one. There's one posted on my Facebook page on my podcast there. You can find it. It's Joe Singer's podcast. And then you'll also find me at my Twitter page. It's Big Joe 1221. If you want to hit me up there, and that's about it. And then make sure to send this all the way around social media. Obviously, to share that around there, and that's about it. Bye, everyone.